Hello, thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this panel, Decolonizing the Canon. It is a real honor to be here. My name is Alessandra Caputo Jaffe, and I will be presenting methodological entanglements and the role of mediation in the process of aestheticization of the indigenous in Venezuela. Okay, well, in this presentation, I return to the methodological issues we face when studying the forms of aesthetic manifestation that are outside the institutional circuits of art in the Western tradition. It should be noted that here I am using the term aesthetics in a broad sense, as a form of knowledge transmission through the sensitive. In spite of being a subject widely approached from the anthropology of art, there is still little dialogue with other disciplines related to art, such as art history and theory, aesthetics, visual studies, etc. The integration of indigenous art into art circuits and institutions implies, on the one hand, a specific intentionality on the part of the agents who produce these manifestations, and also a conciliation or adaptation to the languages and aesthetic criteria developed in the West, as well as the necessary mediations to reach art institutions and markets. In many cases, the willingness of indigenous agents to be part of the artistic discourses has led to a political vindication and a fruitful destabilization of the hegemonic aesthetic discourses perpetuated by Western institutions. And I think now, for example, of the work of the Chilean Mapuche, Sebastián Calfuqueo. On the other hand, however, there are still many indigenous voices that are still trapped in colonialist and paternalistic mediations based on precepts that perpetuate an impassable distance between that which comes from the European tradition and their cultural otherness. So one wonders, do indigenous works of art have to have been intentionally made as art, intended for and produced according to the parameters of a westernized artistic language to enter art institutions? Why are objects that convey knowledge through their visual languages but are not made with the intention of being artistic from the point of view of Western canons, generally confined to the Museum of Ethnography, Anthropology, or even Science? The truth is that it could be said that until the dawn of the 21st century, the process of inclusion of the Amerindian world within the dominant discourses, institutions, and episteme has been fundamentally marginal and continues to be a challenge today. And in order to unravel the complex relationship of the indigenous world with art from a decolonizing perspective, I think it is useful to start with the beginning of the relationship between the culture of domination and the dominated in order to understand the weight and depth that this challenge implies and which concerns all areas of knowledge. If we begin our analysis with the first objects and the first conceptions that were held from the west of Amerindian material culture, we will realize that the construction of the concept of art related to anything indigenous is actually a very recent concept, since until the 20th century, the indigenous world was mainly the object of study of science. At the beginning of the colony, the cultural objects of the indigenous world arrived in Europe in the cabinets of curiosities, as we see in this image of the 16th century Wormsmian Museum, where they also house specimens of stuffed animal species and specimens of plant species, stones, and even the bodies of the Amerindians, living and dead, which were transferred as objectified specimens to appease curiosity, scientific or exoticizing or even morbid, of the European gaze. That is to say, all knowledge about the Amerindian world came from these discoveries, classifications, and descriptions of the natural world. So, if we take into account the old dichotomy between the natural and the human in terms of European thought, the Amerindian fell within the paradigm of a man in a state of nature, and therefore did not really enjoy the same degree of humanity as Europeans. It is necessary to clarify that the dehumanization of the stranger or the enemy is not actually an exclusive practice of the European of the first modernity of the 15th century. And it is not surprising that since the arrival of the colonizers in America, the indigenous people were constantly dehumanized. This explains the constant association of the Amerindian with cannibalism, an action that places those who practice it in the antipodes of humanity, the westernized perspective. And of course, although some Amerindian cultures practice cannibalism, it is certainly not as it is portrayed in this work by Albert Eckhout. It is true that there were characters like Bartolomé de las Casas who helped to vindicate the human character of the indigenous people by giving them the benefit of possessing a soul and therefore the right to life, provided, of course, that they embraced the Christian faith. In any case, it is striking that, particularly on the American continent, science museums continue to be the main repositories of ethnographic and pre-Columbian collections. It is worth noting that during the Enlightenment and the institutionalization of the museum, a severe division was made between cultural objects produced by Europeans and civilizations with which they felt identified, and on the other hand, cultural objects from those societies or cultures considered of scientific interest. It is clear that from a certain perspective, many elements of material culture that were not originally made as art, such as Egyptian art, medieval art, even Greek art, are called art with a capital A. And this dichotomy or this dichotomous division between the capital A arts and the minor arts, however, much attempts have been made to break it down on numerous occasions, and I'm thinking now of Bauhaus and other instances in which utilitarian and craft objects managed to penetrate the art institution. However, this dichotomy has not been possible to overcome even to this day, and this can be seen in the introduction of the indigenous into the museum. Both the pre-Columbian object and the ethnographic object were by default to institutions dedicated to archaeological and ethnographic study, but to physical anthropology, biology, and other sciences. Of course, there have been some attempts to elevate Amerindian material culture to the sphere of the high arts, as is the example of the works I am showing you here by two Venezuelan art historians and critics. Pre-Columbian art, for example, was considered a type of art that could be compared to the same ideal and spiritual quest to which European artists had to adhere to if they wanted to belong to the aesthetic canon imposed by the Enlightenment. However, we have an important differentiation in this area as well. One thing would be the arts produced by the great American civilizations such as the Inca, the Aztec, the Maya, those with which European culture could feel somewhat identified, since they shared a lot of common features, such as large urban centers, monumental sculpture and architecture, complex social hierarchies, etc. And another thing would be those so-called primitive cultures, which, because of the nature of their technologies and forms of social behavior, were considered, until surprisingly recently, as belonging to an evolutionary phase prior to that of modern man. In this sense, the Venezuelan example will be a reference. To begin with, in the lands that today make up Venezuela, there were those fantastic beings that Walter Raleigh would describe in his work, The Discovery of the Great, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guyana, where he confirms the existence of the Amazon, headless men, and other fantastic beings, which, by the way, are ideas that he copies to a great extent from Marco Polo in the 13th century. Furthermore, the Caribbean coasts and the Amazon would be home to those dreaded cannibals that I mentioned earlier, and illustrious philosophers such as the well-known Rousseau, but also Locke and Hume, make reference to those savage Indians who inhabited the Guiana Massif and the Amazon to characterize man in a state of nature, far from reaching the intellectual maturity of the enlightened man of European tradition. In this sense, and unfortunately, the process of integrating the indigenous world not only within the culture, but also within the same parameters of citizenship, and not only in Venezuela, but in general throughout the Americas, continues to be an enormous challenge. And in the 20th century, this difficulty continues, even with the development of anthropology, which, although it helped in part to recognize these people as human, worthy of enjoying the same rights in terms of justice and self determination, continue to some extent to look at these people as mere objects of scientific interest, often under the very dangerous and morally reprehensible perspective of social evolutionism. From the point of view of art, on the one hand, the objects produced by Amerindian people were not considered art, but objects of scientific and anthropological interest. And on the other hand, from the artistic representations that belong to the European canons, the indigenous was generally used in a very instrumental way. First, for the independence cause in the Republican era, and then under the wing of the various Latin American indigenous movements in the first half of the 20th century. They also became symbols of political struggle, such as the socialist cause. But in the art of the 20th century onwards, we do not get to observe in this country such current representations of the indigenous world as we see, for example, in Peru or Mexico, where the indigenous high cultures were easily associated with European civilizing values. And with the arrival of modern art, we also don't see the need for Venezuelan artists to synthesize a new artistic language through imaginaries and vindications of the indigenous and Afro-descendant world, such as the idea developed by Tarsila do Amaral together with Oswald de Andrade of taking that feared cannibalism as the characteristic insignia of the Latin American from a decolonizing perspective. Nor do we observe phenomena such as the discovery of Afro-Asian roots by artists like Wilfredo Lam, who discovers his roots and begins to claim them from exile to perfect them on his return to his native Cuba. And in any case, artists in Venezuela will begin to include the indigenous world in their discourses with greater reticence. And when it becomes more evident from the mid-20th century, it is achieved in an indigenous note belonging to the movement of social realism, and that had a political nuance in which they tried to associate the Amerindian foundational myths with the foundational myth of the Venezuelan state. From the dominant artistic movement in Venezuela in the decade of the 60s onwards, some influences will be observed within the development of the visual logic of Venezuelan artists. This can be seen especially in the design of certain logos, such as the Maiquetía Airport, designed by Gerd Leufert, which is inspired by the stone of the Venezuelan Indian cultures. However, direct references to Amerindian cosmovisions and visual logics during the modern art period are quite rare, let's say. It would seem that indigenous art produced by indigenous people must have a sort of rite of passage or a process of transformation to the syntaxes of westernized art in order to enter art institutions. And we see this in the work of the artist Pepe Lopez, who intervenes the baskets made by the Yecuana men with logos and insignias that are of, let's say, the creolized world. The truth is that around the 1960s, the westernized world began to have more and more contact with the Yanomami. It's between the Venezuelan and Brazilian Amazon region. And until then, it had been an ethnic group feared by explorers and missionaries who'd ventured into the depths of the Amazon. And I don't think it's necessary to explain in that sense that the presumed hostility of these societies to contact with white people was due to quite obvious reasons. In any case, the Yanomami caught the interest of anthropologists from all over the world who began to investigate these populations that were considered by anthropologists such as Napoleon Chagnon as the most primitive cultures still existing on the planet. Without going into detail about the morally questionable practices of these expeditionaries, anthropologists and visitors of all kind, the fact is that it generated over this culture a kind of tourist attraction or exotic attraction, which also included the visit of artists who wished to have an encounter with other or with the cultural otherness. In this sense, it is important to emphasize that I'm not trying to say that all contact with the indigenous world has been from this colonizing and paternalistic posture. Of course, there have also been approaches motivated by a genuine need on the part of both the indigenous world and the Western world to include these societies as a fundamental part of the cultural and political evolution of each nation. So the indigenous people take on a particular relevance in works such as those of Juan Downey, who criticizes the Western worldview itself in the construction of otherness in Latin America. In works such as The Laughing Alligator, we become aware of the incoherence of the parameters that define identities in this continent, where the other or the strange is finally confused with the own. Downey realizes the ridiculousness of the gesture of going to visit the Yanomami, assuming them as strangers and fearsome, being him, the actual and real stranger, who is perpetrating and violating the daily dynamics of that community. On the other hand, we also find interesting exchanges and interventions such as those made by Eugenio Barba's Danish-based theater company, the Odin Theater, in which a genuine festival ritual was performed where not only did one side show the other their dances, but both the theater group and the Yanomami community engaged in a set of dances and songs. It was a real cultural exchange. And in the Venezuelan case, and the Yanomami in particular, there are some genuinely interesting approaches in which indigenous cosmovisions and aesthetic manifestations take on a particular voice. But it's really striking the fact that despite that there are more than 40 ethnic groups within the Venezuelan territory alone, only one indigenous artist has managed to enter the contemporary art scene. And this is the case of the Yanomami artist Sheruanawe Hakiwi, whose work reflects the worldview of his ethnic group through the visual logics belonging to this culture, through a synthetic language faithful to the visual logic manifested both in basketry and in body painting and other supports of the traditional Yanomami material culture. Hakiwe transfers to paper, so a typical format of the art of European tradition, a key element common to several Amazonian people, which is the ecocentric vision. His vision is complemented in that sense by that of Joseca, who's another Yanomami artist, but who lives on the Brazilian side, who has also reached the international artistic sphere. He exhibited at the Cartier Foundation for Contemporary Art in Paris in 2003, together with the photographs of Claudia Andújar. Under a more figurative visual logic, we observe the same ecocentric vision, which centers the focus of knowledge on the relationship between human beings and the ecosystem. It's a very figurative language. However, despite the presence of indigenous voices that have only recently begun to enter the contemporary art scene and that are increasingly being added throughout Latin America, the relationship with objects that were not created under the formats and with the mediations and intentions of European-rooted artistic language is still complicated. There is still reluctance or skepticism to accept within the aesthetic gaze other objects and aesthetic phenomena such as baskets and even statuettes, as well as ritual performances, which are transmitting agents of enormous knowledge regarding worldviews and relationships with the non-human world, as well as with mythical narratives. On many occasions, the reluctance to look at these objects as aesthetically valid is mainly due to the Eurocentric gaze that characterizes art-related disciplines. But I believe that getting rid of this is not only the task of the anthropologist or the archaeologist, but it should be extended to all disciplines and institutions, especially those aimed at knowledge, and particularly in a context as irreversibly mixed, unequal, and complex as the American continent. Thank you very much.